Hello and welcome everyone who's joining us now already. We'll be starting promptly at 11 AM, so if you've joined now, feel free to grab yourself a tea or coffee while we're waiting. We're really happy to be doing our second webinar of our series today, looking at longevity in research and policy, what happens next. I'm joined today by our Senior Research Fellow, Dr. Brian Beach, who will be talking a little bit about sort of key drivers in research and policy on aging and what happens next. While we're waiting, feel free, if you have some pressing questions for Brian already, you can use the Q&A function, which you'll see if you move your mouse at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to already drop some questions there. If you have some questions you want to ask Brian, we'll be coming to these at the end of this webinar. Also, if you want to join the conversation on Twitter, you can do so by using our handle @IRCUK and the hashtag #WhatHappensNext. This is the second webinar of our webinar series that we've just launched, looking at how the coronavirus has affected an aging population. If you want to find out more about our webinars, then do just head to our website, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen here. It's ircuk.org.uk. Our next webinar coming up next week, we'll be looking at how care and housing providers have been responding to the current crisis, and what more can be done, and sort of how we can move in a post-pandemic world. So if you are interested in joining that, then just head to our website. That will be taking place next Thursday from 1 till 2:30 PM. Some confirmed speakers include Professor Martin Green, who's the Chief Executive of Care England, as well as our chair. We'll also have Jane Ashcroft from Anchor Hanover speaking, as well as Nick Sanderson from Audley Group, and a few more speakers. So do feel free to check that out while we're waiting to start. Great, and hello and welcome everyone. It is now 11 AM, so we're going to start. Thanks for joining us for our second webinar, looking at key drivers in research and policy on aging and what happens next. This webinar has been made possible through our Partners Programme, so I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank all of our members, some of whom are on the webinar today as well, for making this possible today. We'll be looking at what the key developments in aging have been across research and policy and where we see them going next. And I'm really happy to be joined by our Senior Research Fellow, Dr. Brian Beach today, who'll be running through some of those with us, looking at how they tie in with some of our work here at ILC, as well as beyond. And we're really keen to have your input as well. So if you're new to this platform, just a few sort of housekeeping rules. If you move your mouse, you should be able to see a tile of options at the bottom of your screen. One of those is a Q&A function. So if you click on that, that's how you can ask your questions to Brian today, and we'll be picking up on those later in the webinar. So do remember to use that function all throughout his presentation. There's also a chat function that you can use. Please make sure that you don't sort of ask your questions on there, as we won't be checking it in the Q&A, but you can use this to either send messages to everyone who's on this webinar today, or directly to me or Brian. And finally, we will be using the poll function today during the webinar. So at some stages in Brian's presentation, you'll see a big screen come up in front of the presentation. So we want to hear your input, what you think the big priorities are, how that's changing in a COVID-19 world and beyond. So please feel free to feed in during those. We'll be recording the webinar today. So if for any reason you need to leave early or you join us a little bit later, don't worry. We'll have the recording as well as the slides of the presentation today up on our website from tomorrow onwards. And I think there's not much more to say at this point. If you do have any connection issues, and of course with more people using the internet at home at the moment, there might be some bandwidth issues. Feel free to either use an Ethernet cable or a hotspot to make sure your connection is stable. If you do drop out of the call, then it's very easy to come back in. So just follow the link that you'll have been sent in your joining instructions, and you can join into the webinar again. Great, so now I'm happy to pass over to Brian. He'll be doing the bulk of the presentation today and running us through sort of his key priorities and where we'll go next. Thank you, Brian.
Great, thanks, Lily. Hopefully the screen has now come up for everyone that I'll be running through my presentation here. So we are talking about longevity and research and policy with our ILC line there, what happens next. For a bit of context, I would like to start by just outlining sort of what I want to discuss today. So the key points and what I hope everyone takes away from this presentation is a better understanding of what we need to do to reframe the longevity revolution. So this is about some of the pervasive narratives that have existed for some time, what needs to change and why they need to change. And that directly relates then to what some of the key priorities we see should be for research and policy as they relate to longevity. And it's unavoidable, I think, in our current circumstances that we will then have to think about the implications of this in the coronavirus pandemic world, but that feeds into a broader conversation around what happens next. For those who've joined us who may be less familiar with our organization, ILC, I think it's important to underscore that we are the UK specialist think tank on the impact of longevity on society and what happens next. So what that means is we've got very much a future look to how we address problems. And it's also not necessarily just the concept of older people and aging as this later life phenomenon, but understanding that longevity happens across the life course and therefore has different impacts on people and overall on society in different ways due to that. We're able to engage in these discussions strongly through taking an evidence-based approach to research that can inform policy, strengthened further by the fact that we are an independent organization and politically neutral. And much of our strength also comes from strong collaborations we've developed with people across various sectors, including the private sector, government, and other civil society organizations. And that being said, we work with a vast array of organizations, from universities, again, to financial services, to other age-related organizations you might know of, like Age UK, and more specialist providers of things like retirement housing, such as Anchor Hanover or Audley. And underpinning a lot of our work too is hoping to take an international perspective, again, informed through the network we have through our ILC Global Alliance. So you'll see there we've got ILCs that exist on every populated continent. So we're going to go first to the poll question. This is an effort to make sure that everyone stays engaged, because I know I'm going to be talking for quite a long time and it can be a bit tedious when we're all just sitting in front of computers. So this is this poll question. There are two questions there you'll see as you scroll down. The first is for us to get a bit of a better sense of what is important to you, the work you do or you personally in this context of longevity. So you'll see a number of different options there. So just pick whichever one you think is most important to you. And then, because my presentation is really geared around identifying these key priorities that we see as important, we wanted to also get you to think about get you to tell us what you think a priority area should be for us before I go into explaining what we've chosen to pursue. So we'll leave that up briefly to make sure everyone has time to read them. I know it's a bit long, but then we'll move on to highlight some of the results from it and get into the main bulk of the presentation. And I should note, of course, there are plenty of other topics that could have been put on this list, and while it is relatively long, I didn't want to make it completely exhaustive. Again, for those who know us, you'll know this. For those who are newer to hearing from ILC, you'll know that we have done work across virtually every one of the things you've seen there, in addition to other topics, because longevity and the aging phenomenon really taps into so many aspects of policy making and society's and social circumstances and lives. So that's done. We've seen, okay, we've got a lot of people from pensions and health, ageism popping up. I think we're seeing that more and more, particularly in the context of some of the discourse related to what happens with the lockdown and as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And then in terms of what people have said with respect to our priority areas, a big one there is ensuring longer lives are good for everyone. The question of health and social care integration, I think also rightly so, is being is rising on the in policy debates because of the circumstances we're seeing with respect to COVID-19 deaths and other things. And again, maximizing the benefits of longevity there is another key priority that you, the audience, have identified. Now, so why really are we having this conversation? It's very important to us that we operate as a player to help reframe the narrative on aging and longevity. For those of you who don't know me, I've been working with aging-related topics and organizations since 2006. So I've become keenly aware of how some of the discourse and the overall sort of public narrative have been around thinking about older people and aging. And in fact, myself, I've had to sort of change some of my assumptions. But I'm sure everyone's going to be familiar with this narrative. This idea that aging is a silver tsunami, it's this tidal wave coming through to destroy us, or that there's this demographic time bomb, and that there are these intergenerational struggles between older people and younger generations that create conflict. Again, this is a really negative narrative on a phenomenon, longevity, that should be actually seen as a positive. The fact that we're living longer is a result of human ingenuity, innovation, and better delivery of healthcare, for example. So why should we think of the fact that we're providing something positive for everyone as an overall social negative? So we've got to really think about how we challenge this. And again, you know, having several years under my belt working in this, it's been positive to see some of the shifts that have happened at very high levels. So you've got the UK government, for example, putting healthy aging in some of their grand challenge thinking. Businesses are opening their eyes to the opportunities that might exist if they can tap into the sort of wealth that exists in later generations. And how this is going to be the reality in the 21st century. And there's a lot of debate around whether or not aging and the fact that our population structure is aging, whether that has to necessarily be a negative. Now, the fact that this is happening and in some degrees is inescapable, we recognize this is going to have an impact on society. And what you're seeing on the screen now are taken from Alex Kalache, who's head of ILC Brazil. I remember first seeing this in Berlin several years ago when he presented it and thinking it was really a nice way of capturing this. On the left of the screen, you see the man's life course today. This has been shaped by historical realities too, so it also relates to the life course of the past, where we thought about it in terms of you go to school and you get learning, you make a transition into employment, sometimes working while you're in school, and then you work, and then you go into retirement, which is very much about leisure and pursuing your own interests. Now, you'll see on the men's life course, they've got a bit of that red, which is the caring thrown in. That becomes much more noticeable when you look to the right on the woman's life course of the future, which in many ways is only a more complicated version of the woman's life course today because of these gendered patterns that we know have existed in society around the delegation of care and presence in the workforce. And what it really shows, I think, is a bit of where we need to go. We need to ensure that education isn't something that ends when people reach the age of 18 or 24 or somewhere in between, but that this lifelong learning concept can be integrated across the life course so that we have opportunities to reskill, upskill, do different kinds of training and pursue different productive pathways. That, however, we do know will have to intersect with greater responsibilities around caring. So these challenges that I know many people are suffering now due to the lockdown, about how do you provide education for your children while also providing the overall child care, while also trying to work from home. Answering those solutions in the context of an aging society, I think will generate benefits for everyone. It also, I think, in this context relates to in the older workers' employment and retirement debates, this question of phased retirement and gradual retirement is seen as a very positive solution. The research from colleagues I know in some of the UK universities have looked at the prevalence of this, and it isn't as extensive in the UK or even in the US as people might think. This concept of being able to gradually retire, it's still often, too often, is a sort of abrupt shift. We need to be able to improve opportunities for people to start doing more blending. And that's what that picture on the right there shows. Now, understanding that longevity needs to be seen as something positive, that it will fundamentally have an impact on our society, and that we need to think about how different aspects of life and the life course overlap and blend together, lead us to some of our key priorities for the future when it comes to thinking about longevity in terms of both the research world that we need so that we have evidence, but also in the policies that shape people's lives. And these are around understanding and maximizing the benefits of longevity. This relates to what some may have heard referred to as the longevity dividend. Essentially, we know that when a population ages, so the average age and the proportion of the population being in later life increases, that there are costs that consequently increase as well. But that also, but looking at just the cost ignores a vast spectrum of opportunity that also exists, whether that's in terms of having older workers in the workforce generating production that way, whether it's about understanding the dynamics of unpaid care with respect to the care sector, or whether it's about understanding where assets exist in the economy and how to tap into those to generate greater consumption and spending. One other factor, and this relates to the second key priority, is that for a long time, and I'm aware of it even back when I started doing research on older workers, is for far too long we've thought of this phenomenon and we've looked at it as a older people issue, and that has unfortunately ignored the vast complexity that exists among people who are in later life. So whether that's on your standard sort of protected characteristics of diversity, like ethnicity or sexuality, but also it relates to the circumstances people find themselves in socioeconomically, with respect to the labor market, with respect to caring responsibilities. So we've got to make sure that as we move forward to understand the impact of longevity on society, we're recognizing that there are many different paths that people will experience as they move through their life course. And finally, the third priority is that we have to ensure, as we look to develop policy, as we look to develop practice, that we're doing our best to future-proof them. Now, that's to say that we cannot model what needs to happen in 20 years based on older people today, because the older people in 20 years will look different, in addition to that sort of diversity and complexity that exists among them themselves. And we know this because when we look back 20 years, 30 years, sometimes looking back 50 years is even more helpful. We see that older people today are vastly different than what they were in the past. So we've got to ensure that we're not making strides to develop policy and practice to address current issues that then just leave us with the necessity to go through all of that effort again in 5 years or 10 years. We need to ensure that there's a better degree of flexibility to policy and practice so that it can be future-proofed as well as it can be now, but will also therefore be adaptable in the future. Now, so going to go into a bit of detail around some of the key, around those three key priorities that I've outlined with reference to other sub-themes that ILC has explored in previous research, but also that have been explored by others. So it's not exclusively ILC work. And the first of these is around maximizing the benefits of longevity. some of you will also know we recently published work around the longevity dividend. I've not incorporated some of that into this presentation, but I highly suggest people go to our website to find out more about that particular piece of work. But when we're thinking about this, whether we think of it in terms of a longevity dividend, or we just think about how can we make the most of the positives that can be taken from increases in longevity. The first is one of the key ones that I highlight here is around aging in local economies. Again, as you'll see as I go through the presentation, I've not tailored anything specifically to the COVID-19 or coronavirus pandemic, but I'm sure most, if not all of these will have special resonance with that phenomenon. But here we see the importance of local economies in the high street, because older people, as we've shown in our work on the missing billions, spend quite a lot of money within the economy and proportionally as a part of the population. So there's a lot to be tapped into there. The interesting thing we've found in our work has been that despite the levels of income that older people tend to have, that their income tends to exceed what they're spending, and spending overall declines from that age of 55 to 75. So the question here isn't why, the answer to the question why older people aren't spending isn't necessarily down to income. There will certainly be groups, again, going back to the diversity of older people, there will be groups of older people who will struggle financially anyway. But on top of this, there must be barriers that prevent older people from spending perhaps as much as they want, or at least as much as they could. So this, again, is just demonstrating that there is an opportunity here. And some of these barriers relate to being able to access services or stores or products, or being able to move around, because we do know that with age comes an increased risk of having mobility issues. So that demonstrates one aspect of how maximizing the benefits can take place in local economies through some simple addressing of these kinds of barriers. Again, just that it's more than just a lack of money. Another way we can think about how to maximize the benefits of longevity. One area we've done a lot of work in has been specialist retirement housing. And this relates fundamentally to this concept of living well, so that as we live longer, we're also living well. And the specialist retirement housing sector, as well as other sectors, have a role to play in enhancing the ability for people to live independently at home. We do know that if you, for example, ask older people where they prefer to die, they say that they prefer to die at home. So what we don't want to do is fall into a pattern where as people approach the end of life, they're having to go into institutional arrangements. We want to be able to enhance the ability to provide home and community-based care, and provide the kinds of services and support people need so that they can stay in home. The specialist retirement housing sector has done a good job at adapting to this reality, to provide homes for people who are in later life, but also to pair that with tailored care delivery that appears when it starts to be needed, it's flexible, and tailored to specific needs. And the reason I highlight this is ILC has done a few pieces of work to demonstrate that these environments, when you compare people living in specialist retirement housing to people living in your general mainstream housing, they do have better outcomes. Outcomes in terms of shorter stays in hospital, a lower likelihood of going into hospital, reduced levels of loneliness, and higher levels of quality of life. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this section, this idea that the barriers for older people's spending are more than just economic or financial. And while this is true, there's also interest in understanding the role of assets for later life. And while this is a very complicated table there that you've got, it comes from a report we did looking at the value of financial advice. And I should note that we have also relatively recently published an update to this. So looking at, so we have the information from a few years ago, and we have an updated version available on our website. But what this table shows, the main takeaway from this, is that even when you control for other factors, such as the likelihood of taking financial advice or being in the economic position in the first place where you would take financial advice, that people who did take professional financial advice ended up better off than those who did not. And further, what the analysis shown is that for those people who didn't take financial advice, maybe because they were less likely to, had they taken it, they also would have been better off than had they not. So again, it highlights that longevity, that there are areas in which we can find opportunity to benefit from this phenomenon of longevity, which commensurately could mitigate certain, some of those perceived negatives that come from an aging population. Now, I've gone through those three things. We're going to throw up another poll for everyone. And this is really just to have you reflect quickly about, of those three sub-themes I mentioned, which do you think is going to increase in urgency or importance as a result of the coronavirus pandemic? It's very likely all of them will be, I mean, everything I think is going to be influenced by this reality. But we wanted to just try to start getting a sense of what our audience thinks will be more important or more urgent. We'll be reflecting on this, and it very well may inform some of the strategies we pursue in our upcoming and future work. Okay. So can we close that and share? Yes. So unsurprisingly, to me at least, the independence at home is one of the key factors, and I think it also relates to some of the to what we're all going through in this sort of imposed self-isolation. It also, I think I'll use this as an opportunity to point to something I hope may be useful for moving forward in response to the coronavirus pandemic and some of the issues that we as an organization and many of like-minded organizations would be interested in, which is what do we do about some of this this proposed intergenerational conflict that exists. And one thing I've thought is, wondered, I suppose, it's still an open question, is whether or not younger people might be able to, younger generations, I should say, because I think I'm thinking younger adults, might have a bit more sympathy for the circumstances of some older people because they're experiencing this degree of isolation, this disconnect in a way from at least the physical world. And the crisis is going to end. So there is an endpoint for a lot of those people. Unfortunately, for older people who experience intense isolation, this is just their normal thing. So perhaps this can lead to a bit of reflection on the part of this, where this intergenerational conflict comes from. So the next priority area to discuss is this one around ensuring longer lives are good for everyone. This fundamentally taps into the question of diversity and the idea that older people are not one homogeneous group. And one of the things I like to say, somewhat provocatively, is the fact that there is no such thing as an older person. Age itself is a measure. It measures something very clear. It has a purpose. But when we start to think about outcomes, or we start to think about issues that impact people's lives, it begins to become less and less useful. And the reason is, we have people who are in their late 50s and early 60s who are too ill to work and have to leave the workforce before they reach state pension age. But equally, we have people who are in their 90s who are setting marathon records. So just knowing the number of someone's age doesn't tell you very much about the kinds of things that impact their ability to go about and do their business or to interact with others. So recognizing the diversity that exists among people in later life, I think will be key moving forward as we look for solutions to different social policy questions. because there fundamentally is no magic bullet or no silver bullet that will solve it for everyone. Now, this is underscored by some of the data that I put up here, which just highlights that we know that for England and Wales, the older population is going to increase in its ethnic diversity in the coming decades. We've known from some of the work we've done, and it's been done by others, that that older LGBT plus people have poor health outcomes, and that they deal with different issues, really, that shape what their the picture of their later life will be, and also for people who have disabilities. One of the interesting things is that the prevalence of disability isn't projected to increase, and in some respects, particular areas of interest like disability, we see that the proportion or the prevalence or proportion won't increase over time, but because the population itself is growing, there will be greater numbers of people who will need support in other kinds of services. So again, it just underpins that when we talk about older people, we're only distinguishing this by a chronological age measure, which doesn't necessarily relate to the circumstances they face or the issues that all of them will have to address. This links to life expectancy, this measure that we have to give us a sense of the direction our population is going in terms of age structure, and in particular, the question around the inequalities that exist in life expectancy, and more importantly, perhaps, inequalities in healthy life expectancy. So just got on the slide there just a couple of examples, because this area is so there's so much information here to unpick. It's hard to identify, to go into detail in this webinar. However, there's the question of, as we have legislation set to increase the state pension age, we know that these inequalities in, again, particularly healthy life expectancy, mean that not everyone is going to be able to work up to the legislated state pension age that will be in the future. That then means we have to start to unpick the implications of that, because we can't solve questions of fiscal sustainability with respect to the pension system on the assumption that everyone will just keep working through that period of mid to late life. We're going to have to be cognizant of the fact that it doesn't mean that all people will work up to state pension age. And again, I think there's been quite a lot we're seeing now, again, as a result of coronavirus, that this health inequality that exists has knock-on effects, not only for, as we're seeing now, who's impacted by the pandemic and the kinds of healthcare that they're able to get, but it's also related to just your broader economic production, again, in more normal times. By recognizing this diversity that exists in later life, by embracing this knowledge that that aging is not the same for everyone, and that there are areas that where inequality needs to be reduced, I think this relates to a broader concept of redefining aging. And from the research perspective, I think a lot of this is understanding better the kinds of perceptions that exist with respect to age, and this brings up the concept of ageism. There have been lots of different, more and more work has been emerging recently to investigate ageism, so how it manifests, where it is, potentially what can be done about it. And I'll just note that for those looking at the screen there, that table on the bottom, each number there represents a different kind of ageism. And I think somewhat in contrast to some of the other isms of discrimination and et cetera that we investigate, the ageism one is incredibly complex. Because you've got these conflicting narratives sometimes. So you'll see on that table on the left-hand side, that positive and negative. This is the idea that sometimes our assumptions about age make us think positive things about someone in contrast to your stereotypical negative isms and discrimination. But for example, I personally sometimes struggle with the idea when I see someone who is obviously older than me in the London Tube, do I give them my seat just because they look older? or is that a form of ageism? You know, it might be kind, it might be respectful, but where is the line from that becoming something that should be avoided and something that's, for lack of a better word, chivalrous? So I think we've got a lot of work still to do, and you know, plenty of accolades to those out there who are doing this work and making it happen. But you know, ageism is still a pervasive concept in society that taps into a number of aspects of our world. So this brings me to the third polling question, which is essentially the same question as you saw last, just with respect to these three sub-themes that I've identified around the diversity, the life expectancy inequalities, and redefining aging. Again, I think the coronavirus pandemic is going to impact every aspect of life. This is just to get a sense of what you, as the audience, think might be the one that sort of gets pushed up in terms of the policy agenda, or even in public awareness and public consciousness. Okay, so can we close and move to the results? So the inequalities in life expectancy. I think that's very sensible. It's 71% have highlighted that. And I fully agree that this is going to be, more and more people are now aware of this, not just as an academic concept, but as something that really impacts people. And in the coronavirus context, it is a matter of life and death. So going on to the third and final theme around future-proofing policy and practice. Again, this is really trying to understand that, you know, when we make assumptions about what people need, when we make assumptions about what policy needs to do to help people, to support them, to encourage them in terms of different behaviors, this is different today than it was generations ago. And therefore, it's going to be different for future generations. So we've got to think deeply, and these are very challenging concepts, but we have to be aware that what solution we may, to which we may arrive today may not be the solution that we need in 20 years. And the key one around this, I think, is my area of expertise around employment in later life and retirement. I'll note just quickly that image of state pension age changes, that should just relate to state pension changes. It wasn't about the new equalities we identified in conjunction with the Extend project led by Alan Walker at Sheffield. It was about the reforms to the system, the shift to a basic single tier state pension that will consequently increase some of the inequalities that exist, not just the change to the state pension age. That being said, this is one of those areas where there's been some substantial work done at very high level with the Fuller Working Lives group in DWP, for example, really investigating some of these dynamics. But we're not done with it yet. So again, as I mentioned in reference to something else earlier in the webinar, the increase to state pension age is not the only solution. It doesn't solve everything magically. And part of this is demonstrated by the work you see in the blue image there, which relates to work we did with the Renewal Consortium at UCL that really just used data to show that this life course influence is real. These negative experiences of psychological trauma and neglect that happen to children is related to their labor market outcomes when they're in later life, related to early exit. So, you know, so again, as we start to think about what policies and practices need to be in place to achieve fuller working lives, we've got to make sure that we're not basing it on assumptions of the past. Another area where this is key and is increasing, I don't want to say exponentially, that's inaccurate, but is just, brought more to the forefront of people's thoughts now because of the lockdown, is the role of technology. Technology has a hugely important place in providing innovations, providing new solutions, making things more efficient, making things easier. It has loads of promise. And there are more and more efforts to investigate what needs to be done, how it can be done well. But for me, there's still an underlying question we have to ask around whether technology is the panacea some claim it to be, or if it's just an empty promise. And I see it because I see some of the efforts to really enhance the use of technology sometimes are happening in places where human touch is fundamentally important. And I don't think, while we need to use technology to improve services, to increase the efficiency of the services that do exist, we can't pretend that we're not going to need people to care for others, as one example. I recently learned of a concept called skin hunger, which is precisely this question that many of us may be experiencing during the lockdown, which is a biological response to not having skin-to-skin contact with others. So therefore, I think it sort of underscores this point that technology has huge promise, but it won't solve every question that remains. And finally, the final theme here is around new relationships and new communities. New communities in the sense that we've seen work over the years by WHO, for example, around age-friendly communities. So what cities or communities can do to ensure they're age-friendly. There's been an extension to that to ensure that these work for people who have dementia, so dementia-friendly initiatives. We're going to see more and more of that. And I think some public sector bodies have been doing work to ensure that their approaches for new policy and policy development reflect the principles contained therein. But it also, I think, relates to the fact that our relationships are different and somewhat related to the growing diversity of people in later life. We don't have the same sort of model of the household that's true for everyone that, again, used to exist in the past. We have more people reaching later life without children. We have the phenomenon of greater divorce and remarriage. And so these mixed families where you've got loads of stepbrothers and stepdaughters, and that disrupts the assumptions that people have put in place into who does what for the future. I'm thinking precisely around the question of unpaid care. Does a son deliver it? Does the stepdaughter, for example? And how does that all get negotiated? So as we're thinking about what needs to be put in place with respect to social policy, with respect to different practice to deliver for older people, we've got to ensure that we are aware of these changing dynamics. Now we're going to move to, we're almost done with you having to listen to my voice, but we are going to have got two questions here. The first one essentially is the same as you've seen as we've gone through each of the other themes. So which of the three that I've identified here do you think has increased in importance because of the pandemic? And then the last one, we'll give you some good time to look over these and think about it, because we're really interested in people giving us their feedback on this, about what you think, because of the pandemic, in the coming months, what should the government or other policy-related organizations, what should they prioritize out of this list? I'll note it's phrased differently, but that list for question 2 there essentially puts all of the sub-themes I've covered in the 3 priority areas into one list. So it should be relatively familiar. But we'll give you a few minutes to do that. And then I'll be moving on to briefly summarize, and we'll be making time for questions and answers that will be moderated by my colleague. And again, I'll note, I've referred to various pieces of research that we've done and published over the past number of years, and all of that should be available on our website. So do go there to find any further information on some of the specifics, and feel free to contact me with any direct questions you may have after the webinar. Right, so can we perhaps, oh yeah. Right, so the new relationships, new communities is very interesting. I sort of expected technology to win, but it makes perfect sense, I think, that new relationships and new communities, because of this pandemic, will be at the forefront of thinking. And so our group really wants, oh, well, do you know, that makes me very happy personally, because I'm very passionate about understanding inequalities and diversity. So addressing inequalities across diverse groups is what our very authoritative audience says the government should do and prioritize in coming months. So that's very good. Thank you very much. Yeah, so you know, that was sort of to inform some of our thinking, and also to make sure that your voice was heard. Because moving forward in this post-coronavirus world, you know, much of our previous thinking, whether it's research interests, areas to prioritize in terms of research or policy, much of this has been upended by the coronavirus pandemic. Not only are we going to see these massive shifts in these macroeconomic indicators like GDP, et cetera, it's also having a massive shift in how we interact, even within businesses, business to business, civil society organizations, and government. A lot is changing. And the virus itself and its impact on things like health and social care delivery aren't the only questions that remain. There are significant challenges for the foreseeable future. And this is because the future is fundamentally unforeseeable right now. We don't know when we'll come out of this. We don't know what we'll be able to do when. I personally am very much looking forward to planning a vacation, holiday somewhere, and none of us knows when that will happen. But in this you know, we will come out of this at some time, in some way. And I strongly believe that the kinds of themes that we've identified here, these 3 priority areas related to longevity, I don't think they will substantially shift as a result of the coronavirus pandemic and where we eventually end up. And all of that goes to say that we've got to think about what happens next. I mean, this is a huge, you know, it's our, I suppose, our one overarching priority as an organization to really inform what happens next. We've got to shift this narrative and the language that's used on aging. Those who are listening who are more familiar with the kind of work that age-related organizations do, you're probably aware, as we are, of a sort of sadness that I feel that, you know, the word elderly keeps being used in debates around like who's vulnerable and who isn't, because as a sector, we've tried to move away from that kind of language because of the connotations it carries. So we've got to get others to start shifting their language and to shift their perceptions and perspectives around the sort of aging phenomenon and longevity. Because if we don't, then we'll continue, then we're not moving forward, and we'll just be where we've been in previous years, and we won't be coming up with the kinds of solutions that will really work for everyone. We've got to challenge these assumptions that we have and those that exist currently in policy, like the continued use of a word like elderly is one example. Because, and you know, or as I've put on the slide there, this idea that, you know, older people have all of this massive housing wealth, and so we don't have to worry so much about financial security. I mean, there are assumptions that are in play when it comes to policy making, when it comes to people thinking about older people, and we've got to challenge those. Because taking all of this together, again, if what's going to happen if we don't shift the narrative is people will be disadvantaged, let's use that word. But what we want to do is really push forward together to build a society that works for everyone, regardless of ethnicity, income, or even their age. On a final note, we have our Future of Aging conference scheduled for the 3rd of December. There's a link there for you to join. We are currently planning to host it in person at Welcome Collection. Social distancing rules to be determined. But that's it from me. I'll turn back over to Lily. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Brian. And thanks for a really, really good presentation. I've seen lots of questions come through that we'll look at now. And just a reminder, do feel free to still post your questions in the Q&A tab. What you can also do, which I find quite helpful, is you can upvote questions that you want us to address. If you want to, you can also comment on questions. So if you have a question that's similar to one that's already up, feel free to maybe add a comment or a sub-question to those so that we can bundle questions. And thanks, Brian. I think you've highlighted really well, sort of on the one hand, how important it is at the moment with everything that's going on with COVID, that we ensure that an aging angle is part of that, and that as we're planning for a post-lockdown and a post-pandemic world, we're thinking about all these trends that are going on. And I think it's really important to note, especially in the current climate, that kind of notion of, aging as an opportunity, as a success. And clearly there's some caveats to that. And there's things we need to do. We need to adapt to the needs of an aging society, but that fundamentally, if we do that, there's some benefits that can come out of that. And we've got a few questions here, Brian, sort of relating to ageism and how we can sort of tackle some attitudes around aging as a negative. And one is asking, for example, here's a question from Janice Humberstone asking, why is ageism still so rife given the sensitivities with, say, racism or sexism? And what do you think it kind of differentiates it from other discriminations?
I think that's a really good question. I don't know that I have the answer to the question. One of the things that I think may influence, may be an influence there and partially answer the question, but I do also think will help us identify solutions to addressing it, is the fact that age, unlike other characteristics, for the most part, doesn't remain constant. So your gender, for the most part, stays constant. You are that or not. Your ethnicity is that or not. Whereas age is something that changes over time. Now, I think that actually might open up a way for us to help people understand their own isms, as we'll call it, because if you're being if you're a younger person being heavily ageist against an older person, in a way you're being discriminatory toward your future self. And so I think that relates to some of the work around the concept of othering and how like racism and those come about because of the othering of others. And I think age, because it's one of those that changes, so we're all going through different stages of the life course rather than staying stuck in one. I think that is also related to the sort of that pervasive youth culture, why people fear getting older. It's because of their own internalized ageism, rather than recognizing that life is something that changes over time, just like they do.
And we've had a few comments here as well saying that, in some ways COVID might have increased our ageism. But looking at, something you said previously as well as, is there a potential at the moment, do you think, that people experiencing isolation, even if they're younger, people clearly being worried about either older parents or grandparents, do you think there's some ways that it's actually an opportunity?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it absolutely is an opportunity. Whether or not we'll, as a sort of society, be able to harness the opportunity and completely eliminate it, it's a different question, or still a question that's still open. But on the one hand, because there are two dynamics going on. So I think ageism is more prevalent, both in terms of for example, some of the policies around telling people because they're 70 and over they should isolate and shield themselves. I mean, you know, it's, you can there's a strong case to be made that that is just an outright ageist approach. It may, it has, I do think it has certain degrees of merit, but needs to be nuanced a bit better. But, you know, you've got some policy decisions and policy discourse coming out that I think might be entrenching some ageist attitudes. But as you noted, Lily, there are other elements here that might actually be getting people to sort of, you know, take those blinders off. And, you know, one of the best, a good representation of this is the meme around sort of having like your midlife aged people feeling like they're having to treat their parents like the parents treated them when they were kids, about not going out and stuff like that. So, you know, I think there are both dynamics going on. So I would say for organizations like us and anyone else working as part of sort of an age-related organization, our job in this time is really to help ensure that people's attention is being steered to the right side of the perspective.
Yeah, really interesting. And I guess we'll sort of see how intergenerational relations develop as we go through this. Now, looking at the sort of wider benefit question and the opportunities of aging, we've had a question looking at sort of what is the measure of benefit, and how can we say, other than in economic terms, that aging is a good thing?
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but I would say that most people want to live longer if given the choice. I think that's sort of where you start. Now, and this is where the discussions, the nuance, some of these understandings become relevant, because people don't want to live 40 years with severe dementia, for example, which I know doesn't happen in reality. But, you know, so this is what it highlights, that in an ideal world, we would all live very long and we would all be very healthy and very active and engaged. So maximizing the benefits of the fact that we're living longer comes back to ensuring that people have access to the opportunities that they themselves feel they want in order to have a fulfilling life. That's sort of that's what I would say is sort of your base rationale for why we want to maximize benefits.
Yeah, and you mentioned sort of fairly early on that, you know, as we're aging, we have to adapt to not only longer lives, but sort of changing life shapes. And we've got a question here from one of our researchers, Aaron, actually asking, you know, why is it that despite these changes and, you know, more talk about flexible working, gradual retirement, why is it that we are still only seeing very few companies offer opportunities to gradually retire?
I think because change is hard. You know, it's if I'm speaking from trying to put on the hat of a large employer, there are going to be so many costs involved with making large-scale shifts towards that, that it may be unclear that that you'll recoup your investment, or that it will be more beneficial long term. I think that sometimes, because, you know, again, going back to the idea that I've been working on this since 2006, so much of this is just so obvious to me, but it's not going to be obvious to people who've never been introduced to it or heard about it before. So so while we may talk about flexible working being such a panacea, potential panacea, you know, some businesses don't, you know, they might hear about flexible working and be like, well, that's just not even relevant for our industry. Now, that's a good topic to discuss in terms of COVID-19, because now many businesses who may not have thought about being flexible in terms of telecommuting and stuff like that, if they're able to do it, then they've been working to figure this out and introduce these solutions. So hopefully we'll be seeing greater awareness of the idea that, well, actually, you know, we are going to see greater awareness of the fact that we've got to do things differently, because we will have, at the end of this, gone through a period where most people are having to do things differently.
And if learning is slow, potentially for some businesses and maybe smaller businesses as well, do you think there's a role for government in that?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I might want to defer. I mean, I'm not someone who shies away from sort of government intervention. I strongly believe in the role of the welfare state, but I also believe businesses, require a high degree of independence in order to sort of maximize their efficiency, to stimulate, to pursue innovation in the ways that they see fit. I think that sort of competition within the market can be a really useful driver for some changes. So I do think the government has a role, but I'm unclear the extent to which it's government forcing. I don't want to say that the government should force employers to do anything in that respect. But if, there is scope for employers to consider how best to extract from government the support they identify that they need.
Brilliant. And looking at the other end of sort of retirement, we've had a question here sort of relating to retirement income. Mm-hmm. And Alison Benzema has asked, so if financial advice improves people's financial situations post-retirement, does the current sort of traditional financial advisor model contribute to sort of further inequalities in later life? How do you think this might be able to be addressed for people who wouldn't usually have access to this advice?
Yeah, it's a very good point. The work we did was specific to professional financial advice. So in that respect, it does tap into this broader sector. And I suppose my answer to that is, the work we did highlights that it is beneficial to receive this kind of financial advice. So with respect to the question, I think it just comes back to how do you reduce barriers and how do you reduce inequality? Why is it? I mean, the detail, it may be very clear to those who work in the sector. They may have better answers than I do. But I think it's about reflecting on what are the barriers, how do you reduce them? So how do you make this kind of advice available for all?
Thank you. And now just shifting onto sort of quite a different topic here. We've had a question from John Miles asking, what's the relationship between ILC support for retirement housing, but on the other hand, sort of a need to maintain age-diverse neighbourhoods and sort of avoiding further entrenching sort of spatial segregation between generations. So sort of what are the benefits of retirement housing, and how can we make sure that by supporting some ways of retirement and later life living, we're not further segregating people?
I suppose my answer to that is really that various pieces of work, some of which we've done, some of which others have done, have tapped into the idea that there's substantially more demand among older people for this kind of housing than currently exists. So I mean, that's sort of where I start, that, part of the challenge for your retirement housing sector more broadly is how to generate greater levels of supply. So, the part of this is around demonstrating that there are benefits so that investors feel, more confident in putting their money into stimulating the sector. The question around age segregated communities, I think one of the, it's very important consideration. We don't want to be creating artificial ghettos, of course. But if older people, if people in later life themselves are wanting this kind of housing model provided for them, then we should encourage movement in the sector to supply it for them. I'll also, however, highlight that when we look at the age structure and demographic change across, I'll say England, I'm not sure if it's all of the UK or not. But one of the phenomena we're seeing is that, for example, your average age in a place like Manchester hasn't really changed over years. Urban areas draw in some of the younger people from the more rural communities. So in a way, we're seeing age segregation happen based on this sort of rural-urban or town-city divide already, which is something we certainly need to be aware of and think about what the consequences this will be for those local communities and their economies and things like that.
Yeah, and you touched on the fact that, you know, there's clearly still a lot more that we need in terms of adapted housing, retirement, housing stock. And sort of within this context, where actually quite a lot of our housing is really not perfectly sort of suited to the needs of people. How do you think, because obviously a key part of your presentation and sort of how we can maximize the benefits of longevity is keeping people independent, keeping them healthy. And we've got a question here asking, you know, do you think that maintaining independence is feasible given the existing housing stock and general housing imbalance?
So the first thing I'll say is that because it does also relate to the last question. I mean, you know, the vast majority, 90 to 95% of older people live in mainstream housing. So it isn't that we're not going to see a world where all older people are living in institutions or retirement villages. You know, that's just not the way the numbers will go. Sorry, can you remind me the question?
It was asking sort of around whether this independence is really feasible, and if we need a lot more innovation in the sort of housing sector to make sure that that's possible.
Yeah, I think there are two elements here. One is certainly the idea that we need to ensure that housing is adequate in terms of being decent. You know, so that it doesn't contribute to poor health. So addressing issues like poor carpeting that causes falls, or mold and damp that facilitate respiratory infections and things like that. So we've got to ensure that the housing that exists is, for lack of a better term, up to code. But I'll also say that on the question of, you know, maintaining independence, I wouldn't say that it's about, you know, people not needing anyone else or needing anything else. It's not a sort of 100% independent, leave me alone question. It's about people being able to function on a day-to-day basis fully at home. And that may require a bit of assistance. So again, I think it taps into your into the delivery of adult social care and the kinds of paid and unpaid ability to get support with different activities.
Yeah, really interesting. And we've had a couple of questions here as well on care, obviously a very big topic at the moment. And I think the current crisis has sort of shown, again, all too starkly sort of how far behind we are in some ways. We've got a question here sort of saying, rather than framing the discussion around health and social care integration, which we seem to have been trying for years with limited success, can we reframe our thinking about social care so that we really start to give it the value and importance it deserves that's been so absent in the current situation? And do you think there's some impetus from the current pandemic that we could actually sort of move forward a little bit on this?
I hope. Absolutely hope. I've been having various conversations this week around this theme of integration. The point that was made in the question about reframing it so that it gets the respect it deserves. Again, absolutely, completely agree with that. I don't want to disparage any step in the right direction, but the idea of the care badge, while it's a great thing, I hope it doesn't turn out to just be some symbolic sticking plaster. We need to see concrete action on the ground. I think that sort of elevating the esteem of social care up to the same kind of parity that the NHS has, I think would do wonders. I personally don't have any answers on how to do that. But one of the things that was intriguing to me, you can probably hear from my accent, I'm American, so I've not been living in the UK and studying the UK all my life. One of the things that I was interested was in a conversation I had earlier this week on the theme of integration. And because of the sort of context in which I've learned about health and social care in the UK, in my mind, had thought of them as being completely separate all this time. And the person to whom I was speaking highlighted that think about it as actually reintegration. Because back, sort of at the beginning of the NHS, there was a bit more integration through the provision of different kinds of invalid hospitals, for example. So that may itself, be a key to stimulating the debate, driving the debate more toward actually making real strides in integration. But again, linking back to the question, the respect that the social care deserves, I think, will have to happen if we're going to see any substantial moves.
And on that, really, we've had another question from David Blaine asking whether this sort of recognition that we've had of key and essential workers, and I think beyond sort of social care as well, if that could challenge some of the notions that we have in our current social status system, and if it could lead to some strides in reducing inequality.
I certainly would hope so. I think that shift in the language around the use of key workers and essential workers, the juxtaposition of that discussion with what we were talking about a few years ago around unskilled labor, and again, as an American, as a migrant to this country, I'm a bit more familiar with what you have to do to get a visa and migrate, and it's a bit staggering, and for me to deal with, much less someone who comes from a more vulnerable background or who has greater issues than I do hope that this shift in language can be used to reduce inequalities, because when we start to think about the kinds of remuneration that's given to employees, when we think about the kinds of packages of social support that should exist for a robust welfare state that provides the kind of safety net that needs to exist, this will all have to be factored in. And I hope that the esteem or the recognition, the respect that's being given toward the role of key workers and essential workers, I hope that maintains, and that it gets translated into some real things that make a difference for people's lives. And if so, I think that will reduce inequality. So it doesn't have to be necessarily we're going to reduce inequality by doing this, but I think if we start to line things up a bit better with respect to some of these very important class issues that have been starkly shown to us as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, I think that will have a consequent positive influence on inequality.
And a really quick question from me is, with COVID taking center stage in sort of media and most of policy debates at the moment, even with really big pressing questions such as Brexit taking the sidelines at the moment, how can we ensure that a conversation that clearly is very much needed on aging and longevity policy doesn't sort of trail behind, and that we make sure it's on the agenda?
I think there are two things, and in a way this might sound like a fudged answer, but on the one hand, I think that because of how COVID has impacted the reality that we are living through during this, at least in this stage of the pandemic, highlights some of the things that us working in aging and longevity have been trying to convey, these important messages that we've been trying to get into policymakers' heads so that it influences their decision making. So we can use actually the experiences of the pandemic to illustrate the importance of these issues. And the reason I said I hope it doesn't sound like a fudge is because I also think at the same time, if done well or strategically, talking about something that isn't COVID might actually be appealing to some policymakers, particularly as we start to move in the end phase of this, because we know that particularly those at very high ministerial levels, they have to think about this constantly, the COVID crisis. So, on the one hand, we can use it to our advantage by framing it, using it as a tool to frame the conversation. But then I think we can also perhaps at a relatively later stage, use it as a way to get attention by being something different.
No, absolutely. I think that's really important for lots of people that will be on the webinar as well at the moment. And looking at sort of other really sort of big policy issues, we've had a question come in here from someone sort of around how we can maximize the benefits of longevity and encourage spending. How can we make sure that we're not encouraging overconsumption, that we make sure that we're still promoting this sustainability agenda? And how do you think, maybe more broadly, does the climate change agenda tie into a longevity debate?
Yeah, it's a very important issue. One thing, because this is not the first time I've been sort of asked this question with respect to some of especially the topic around the consumption question. I certainly want to underscore that the point around maximizing the benefits through enhancing consumption and spending, that they aren't meant to say we need to get older people to spend all their money so that we can take it, and et cetera. It's more about recognizing that when we just look at some of the figures and the trends, there appear to be barriers for older people, and at least in terms of what their spending could be. I think we've got there are opportunities to investigate that spending a bit further, to find out the degree to which the spending is sustainable or not, because that's fundamentally the question. A lot of spending on unsustainable industries will be bad, but as in the climate change debate, some industries are doing a great job at shifting their products or their services into more sustainable delivery. And so, if we can think about how to make consumption more sustainable, how to make consumption friendlier for a world that's at risk of severe and catastrophic climate change, then those solutions for more sustainable consumption we should also ensure there are no barriers related to age or later life that prevent older people from being able to engage in that consumption too.
Yeah, and we've had another sort of comment come through on that topic as well, saying that, actually, could it be helpful to have clearer avenues for people to, say, invest personal financial assets or maybe pensions in socially progressive objectives, or including a sort of Green New Deal? And what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I understand the question perfectly, but I think one of the questions something I've learned from engaging with people who are really more engaged with delivering financial products and the pension side of stuff. I think that particularly if we're trying to look as big picture as we can, or reach the largest number of people possible, I think when it comes to pensions, we need to not expect people to manage their own pensions. Again, this is informed but a personal take, because the complexity is just so much and most people are not going to be interested. So with respect to the question of how can that be targeted more towards sustainable investments or investments in sustainable energy or other industries, I think that provider or some kind of financial portfolio manager, they could certainly market themselves as being eco-friendly, for example, and that could tap into that. The Green New Deal, I think, is a different set of considerations, because that would be more of your sort of macro policy development. So I won't go into that just yet.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we are coming up shortly to time. So just a reminder that if you still have a burning question, then do send it through now. And unfortunately, we probably won't be able to get through all of our questions today. We've got one sort of more general question, and I think it ties into lots of what we've been talking about today, asking sort of how can we as an aging sector balance the messaging both between the fact that, as you say, not all older people are vulnerable, but that also many older people may be vulnerable, particularly in the current climate. So how do we make sure that we're not sort of assuming everyone is vulnerable, but not excluding people from that debate?
I think that, there's this constant push and pull, perhaps, between needing to, be be authoritative, not authoritarian, but being authoritative as a government to, give, instructions as what is the best practice for the population, particularly at a time like this. But there's push and pull between that and the idea of ensuring individual freedoms and liberties and, personal will, free will, decision making. So, I think this question, if I've understood correctly, sort of relates back to whether or not, government should say 70-year-olds should isolate. I think it'd be much nicer to recommend it, but also to highlight people. But if you've got a, underlying condition, the things that actually matter with respect to the reason for isolation or shielding, that making that recommendation be like, you really need to take this on yourself. It's a tricky one because, and I think all governments, again, to refer back to my being American, we're seeing some very different approaches in terms of that sort of government guidance and restrictions across the states. And at the moment, it looks like it will end up with worse outcomes for public health. Only it's early days still in terms of the data. But.
Yeah, and I should have probably pre-warned you of this, but Brian, I find it really interesting to ask you actually, on our last question on sort of what the key priorities should be in the coming months due to the pandemic, and I can relaunch the poll quickly for everyone to see the options again. But what do you think we should be doing?
Well, I think from the perspective of the coming months, I think I agree with the consensus around addressing inequalities across diverse groups, because on the one hand we have, we're seeing variations according to ethnicity and to a certain extent gender too, and we're seeing differences in outcomes as a result of those who end up with COVID-19. So, if we don't address those and that sort of inequality that's happening in terms of even with respect to some of the potential drivers for the outcomes, these health outcomes related to the pandemic, we're going to be in a worse place. The one I would come to next, I think, is also about ensuring people have the money they need. This is a really interesting question that I don't know that we would have been able to have these kinds of conversations in as productive way had this sort of huge lockdown not occurred. This idea that, we recognize the need for people to have the medicine they need, the care they need. We work to ensure they have the housing they need. And when you start to get into some other stuff like food, some real basic human needs like food, I mean, we don't have much of a social safety net for that, really. The food banks, we know that this was in the UK news for a long time before the pandemic hit, the role that food banks were playing in providing people with the food they need. That links back to this question of the money. So if people need a certain amount of money, that we've got to think carefully about how to ensure that the social safety net that exists can make sure that it's reaching people and that it's adequate and that it serves the purpose it needs to serve in the bigger picture. And Lily, you might know, I'm using this as a way to plug a blog and video I did for the website on universal basic income and services a couple of weeks ago. So I'm not gonna say that that's the absolute answer to the question or to the problem, but I do think it needs serious debate and consideration. And I think this is a great time to take those considerations.
Yeah, and to pick up on that for people who might not have seen the video or the blog, obviously there have been sort of new debates around the potential for universal basic income or universal basic services. And without asking you to sort of recount your entire blog or video, what do you think the debate is looking like? What do you think the potential might be, both here in the UK as well as sort of abroad?
Well, the broader debate, I think, I'm by no means, a very, very detailed expert on the subject of UBI or UBS. But I think the debate currently is, well, some of it is circumstantial. So the crisis has led to governments needing to figure out a way to make sure that people don't just, go without for months, because, this isn't a crisis that's lasting for a week. It's going to, they knew from the beginning it would take several months to move through. And so if people, since people need money, there has to be a solution to it. So this is the one that they've, so even here, there's this sort of the job retention scheme and things, different ways of ensuring that people have income, have finance. In terms of the reflecting back on the argument and the debate, I think people are still thinking about it in strictly income terms. So it's still the question of how can you afford to provide everyone with a certain amount of money? And it's a very, very good question, because the short answer is you can't, unless you make sure that they have some of the other fundamental things that they need to, that's done in a balanced way. So, a lot of my thinking on this has been informed by the work, by others' work. And, the key lesson there really was that what needs to shift is this idea that when we have a welfare state, or we're providing a social safety net through a social security system, social protection systems, that fundamentally, having money, income has to be another element to that. That's given on that universal basis, similarly as to how we do education for the most part, and healthcare.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Brian. And I think that is taking us to the end of our questions today. I'd like to thank you for a really, really interesting presentation and discussion today. I've definitely learned a lot, and I think we've had some really interesting questions as well. So thanks everyone who's joined us and has sent through their questions. This is just another opportunity to thank members of our partners program who have made the webinar today possible, as well as our broader webinar series that will be sort of running weekly from now on. If you are interested in finding out more about our partners program, you can do so on our website as well. Membership includes benefits including business intelligence, access to our networks and connections, and wider brand benefits. If you want to find out more, as I mentioned, do head to our website or get directly in touch with our head of partnerships and development, Reg Wesley, and you can see his email address here at the bottom of the screen as well. As Brian mentioned, we'll also be holding social distancing, provided our next Future of Aging conference in December. So this is our 6th annual conference, and this year we'll be focusing on actually sort of lots of the themes that we've been covering today around how we can come together across generations, and how we can make sure that both policy and practice are working for today's as well as tomorrow's older and younger people. Again, for now, we're going ahead with a physical conference, which will be held at the Welcome Collection. So people who joined us for our last conference will know the venue already. So do take a look at futureofaging.org.uk, where you can register and find out a little bit more about the sessions and speakers. We're also running a blog series as part of this. So if you'd be interested in submitting a guest blog, then please feel free to get in touch with us. And we hope to see lots of you there, hopefully in person. And now essentially all that's left to say is thank you all again. As mentioned, this has been our 2nd webinar. Our next webinar will be next Thursday, looking at how housing and care providers can support people during the crisis, and especially those most vulnerable. That's been supported by 2 of our partners, Audley Group and Anchor Hanover, and we hope you'll be able to join us either this webinar or a future one in the next coming weeks. Thank you, everyone.